The United States just declared it's willing to take Greenland by force. France is mobilizing troops, and Russia is warning of catastrophic consequences. Is the Arctic about to become the world's next major conflict zone? For decades, Greenland has been a geopolitical afterthought. But with melting ice revealing new trade routes and rare earth minerals, the island has become a global battleground. The US has tried and failed to buy Greenland before. Now, in 2025, Washington isn't taking no for an answer.
Vice President J.D. Vance is heading to Greenland. President Trump insisting the U.S. will, quote, go as far as we have to go to gain control of the island.
Is because our friends in Denmark have not done their job in keeping this area safe. If that means that we need to take more territorial interest in Greenland, that is what President Trump is going to do.
Will Denmark and the EU be able to resist U.S. pressure? Could this trigger a new Cold War in the Arctic? And what does Russia's latest warning really mean? To understand, we have to look at the United States' escalating ambitions and why President Trump refuses to take no for an answer. For decades, Greenland was seen as a remote, frozen outpost. But that's no longer the case. Beneath its icy surface lies a treasure trove of rare earth minerals, resources crucial for the world's technology and defense industries. And as climate change melts the Arctic, new shipping lanes are opening, turning Greenland into a strategic gateway for global trade. But there's more. Its location in the North Atlantic, sitting right between North America and Europe, makes it a key vantage point for monitoring Russian and Chinese activity. The US already operates the Catastrophic space base here, a Cold War-era stronghold, but now it wants full control. Donald Trump first floated the idea of buying Greenland back in 2019, only to be laughed off the stage by Denmark. Now, in 2025, he isn't asking, he's demanding. With the backing of Vice President J.D. Vance, the administration has ramped up pressure on Denmark, framing Greenland as a matter of national security. Trump has made it clear the U.S. will secure Greenland one way or another. Now, everyone wants to know how far he is willing to take it. Economic coercion, diplomatic strong-arming. Is he willing to take it too far with a military intervention? But Denmark is just as defiant. Prime Minister Frederiksen denounced U.S. pressure as unacceptable and vowed to protect Greenland's right to self-determination. Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen criticized Vance's disrespectful accusations that Denmark had neglected Greenland's security, pointing to Copenhagen's new $2.05 billion Arctic defense package. Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen announced a historic $2 billion Arctic defense package, including new warships, surveillance drones, and airfield upgrades for NATO's F-35 fighter jets. But Washington still isn't impressed. And here's where it gets even more dangerous. The Trump administration is citing a little-known 19th century U.S. claim to Greenland as legal justification for its renewed push. The White House is also leveraging a Cold War-era defense agreement with Denmark that already grants U.S. military access to Greenland, arguing that Washington is the island's true security guarantor. Trump's latest pitch? A so-called Golden Dome missile defense system to turn all American states and bases, including Greenland, into a high-tech fortress. But for many, this doesn't look like protection. It looks like annexation. With tensions rising and military threats now on the table, Denmark isn't standing alone. France and the EU have stepped in, warning the US that Greenland's sovereignty isn't up for debate. France wasn't going to stand by and watch the United States muscle its way into Greenland. When Washington hinted at annexation, Paris responded with an unmistakable message. If Denmark calls for help, France will be there. That statement from French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles, raising the prospect of European troops facing off against U.S. forces in the Arctic. But as tensions escalated, Paris took a step back. By March 28th, France had ruled out direct military intervention, shifting instead to a strategy of diplomatic resistance. President Emmanuel Macron made it clear Greenland's sovereignty was a European matter, and any resolution had to come through political channels, not military confrontation. That didn't mean Denmark was left to fend for itself. In a whirlwind diplomatic tour across Europe, Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen secured strong symbolic backing from key EU allies. Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz declared that borders are inviolable, while Macron warned that the Arctic must not become a battleground for great power rivalries. Even the UK, under Prime Minister Keir Starmer, joined a European coalition of the willing, though their military focus remained tied to Ukraine rather than Greenland. But the cracks in Europe's united front aren't hard to spot. While Nordic nations like Sweden and Finland stood firmly behind Denmark, other EU leaders hesitated. Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni questioned the feasibility of a European military reassurance force, warning it could provoke rather than deter conflict. And despite the tough talk from Brussels, Washington wasn't exactly trembling. The message from the US was clear. Europe's protests wouldn't change the reality on the ground. If Denmark wanted to hold on to Greenland, it would have to do so on its own. But just as the crisis seemed to reach a boiling point, another global power stepped in. Russia, watching from the sidelines, had a warning of its own. Russia had been watching the crisis unfold in Greenland with growing concern, but now Moscow was making its position crystal clear. In a fiery speech from Murmansk, President Vladimir Putin issued a stark warning. If the US turned Greenland into a NATO stronghold, Russia would take all necessary measures to protect its Arctic interests. He stopped short of direct intervention, calling the crisis a bilateral issue between the US and Denmark. But the message was unmistakable. Moscow would not tolerate another NATO foothold near its northern frontier. That warning wasn't just rhetoric. Days after Putin's speech, Russia's northern fleet continued live-fire exercises in the Arctic, testing hypersonic Zircon missiles and deploying nuclear-capable submarines near Franz Josef Land, just 1,200 miles from Greenland. Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu called it a response to NATO's reckless expansion, emphasizing that the Arctic was not up for grabs. The drills sent a clear signal to Washington. If the US militarized Greenland, Russia had the firepower to push back. But behind the saber-rattling, Moscow's strategy was more calculated. The Kremlin sees the Arctic as an economic and military prize, and Greenland's untapped resources represent direct competition to Russia's dominance in the region. Moscow already claims control over 30% of Arctic oil reserves and 13% of the world's rare earth metals, while state-owned Rosatom controls the Northern Sea Route, an emerging trade corridor that could rival the Northwest Passage. If the US were to establish a foothold in Greenland, it wouldn't just be a military threat, it would be an economic one too. Militarily, Russia has spent years fortifying its Arctic presence. From Nagarskoye Air Base, just 600 miles from Greenland, to its upgraded radar stations in Siberia, Moscow has built an extensive surveillance and missile defense network designed to counter NATO expansion. Now, with US ambitions in Greenland escalating, those defensive systems were on high alert. But Putin wasn't just playing defense. He was looking for ways to turn the crisis into an advantage. In diplomatic circles, Russia framed US aggression as proof of Western imperialism, urging Greenland to consider alliances outside of NATO. Yet for all its warnings, Moscow wasn't looking for a direct fight. Russia still exports Arctic liquefied natural gas, LNG, to Denmark and other EU nations. And even as tensions rose, economic ties remained intact. Putin's refusal to back Greenland's independence movement signaled restraint. Russia wasn't looking to ignite war, just to undermine NATO's position and keep the Arctic from becoming a battlefield. The main question remains, is Greenland about to become the next geopolitical flashpoint? For Greenlanders, the crisis isn't just about geopolitics, it's about their future. With a population of just 57,000, mostly Inuit, Greenland has been pushing for independence from Denmark for decades. But the island remains economically reliant on Copenhagen, receiving annual subsidies that account for nearly half of its budget. Now, as the US ramps up pressure, Greenland finds itself caught between great powers while trying to secure its own sovereignty. That struggle was on full display when it was announced that Second Lady Usha Vance had planned a high-profile visit, marketed as a cultural outreach mission, including stops at the Avanata Kshimuserasu dog sled race and Nuuk's historical sites. This visit comes shockingly at a time when tension is high, with rumors of Greenland annexation by the US government flying around. Following the break of the news, there was several public protests, especially in Nuuk, with demonstrators holding signs reading "Respect international agreements" and "Make America go away." The message was clear: Greenland was not for sale. A January 2025 poll found that 85% of Greenlanders opposed U.S. annexation. And INVADE didn't mince words. "We will never be Americans. Don't treat us with disrespect." Greenland's Prime Minister, INVADE, slammed the visit as part of a very aggressive U.S. pressure campaign and called for international condemnation, as they had not extended any invitation either officially or privately. In response, Washington quietly scaled back the trip, limiting it to Pitufik Space Base, a decision Danish Defense Minister Troels Lund Poulsen called wise. Yet, despite the outrage, the U.S. remained unapologetic. President Trump insisted that Greenland was crucial for monitoring Russian and Chinese activity in the Arctic, declaring, "We need Greenland, one way or another." Meanwhile, Vice President J.D. Vance took a softer approach, urging Greenlanders to cut a deal with the U.S. and move on from Denmark. Energy Secretary Chris Wright echoed the economic incentives, hinting at American investment in Greenland's rare earth minerals, which account for 10% of global reserves, touting the promise of thousands of jobs. But Greenland's leaders weren't buying it. The island's March 2025 elections had resulted in a pro-independence coalition, and incoming Prime Minister Jens Frederik Nielsen vowed to stick together against foreign pressure. Even parties that disagreed on the timeline for independence united against the idea of American control. At its core, the crisis exposed a deeper ethical dilemma, one that went beyond military strategy and resources. The forced annexation of Greenland would not only violate international law, but also threaten the rights of Arctic indigenous communities. Critics compared Trump's rhetoric to colonialism, accusing Washington of seeing Greenland not as a nation, but as a strategic asset to be claimed. For now, Greenland stands firm, backed by Denmark and the EU. But as the crisis unfolds, one question lingers. Will the world respect Greenland's right to choose its own destiny, or will great powers decide it for them?